Good evening and welcome to the Monday, January 14th Issaquah City Council Committee Work Session. This is technically a special meeting because we are starting at 7 p.m. this evening. And we have two items on the agenda this evening. The first is ID 0288, Gilman Boulevard Corridor Framework, and that is going to be, there's a cast of thousands, but it's going to be corralled by Kurt Seaman, our transportation manager.
Thank you, Council President Martz. Very happy to be here tonight. I'm Kurt Seaman, the transportation manager here at the city, and there is a cast of thousands, actually just 3 people that will be making the most of the presentation. So this is the Gilman Framework Plan. We've been working on this for just about a year, and we've done a lot of really great work, and these are the folks much more than me that have been doing the bulk of the work, so they're going to tell you about what they've been doing. So let me introduce the folks here. So this is Brianne Ross, formerly from the city of Issaquah, now working for Petite, but she's come, we're lucky to have her back tonight. And Nathan Polanski is Nicole Mahothra are both project managers on this job and have really been a joy to work with. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brianne. She's going to start us off and walk us through everything we're done, and then I'm going to finish up and talk a little bit about what the next steps are. So Brianne, do you want to start?
All right. Thank you very much. I came back today because I had been managing Gilman for the last year, and so it seemed fitting to see it through and discuss it with you all tonight. The purpose of our meeting tonight is to gain council's endorsement of the framework. That will allow us to move forward with the next steps, which would be the concept development, with some confidence that you agree that we're heading in the right direction. So this framework is a higher level visioning document. You're not going to find cross sections or concept in there yet. That's really the work of the next phase. And so this was really, the purpose of this document was to document all of our community engagement that we've done the last year and get into the higher level visioning, the goals, the opportunities, the challenges that we see with Gilman. And then next steps that Kurt will talk about will include that concept development. So Gilman, we're talking about from SR 900 to Front Street. And I wanted to make sure we were clear on the relationship between this document, the framework, as well as the corridor concept, future corridor concept, in relationship to the Central Issaquah Plan and the Central Issaquah Design Standards. So during the Central Issaquah plan development, it was clear that Gilman was a vital and important corridor for Central Issaquah and always would be. And at that time, there was limited time and resources to dedicate the attention that staff thought that it deserved and to really truly flesh out what Gilman should be. And so in the design standards, it really says that Gilman should be determined at this point on a case-by-case basis. And so what we are doing with this framework and the concept development is really in line with the policy that was adopted with Central Issaquah Plan and the land use and supporting everything in that plan. And it is further defining the standard for Gilman. So again, right now, when a developer comes in, like Corner Bakery or Atlas or the Gilman Lofts, we didn't have a standard to provide that developer to say, here's where your building should be, here's what our right-of-way needs are for pedestrians, bikes, transit, and vehicles. And so that's really the true need for this project. There's also a high number of traffic accidents on Gilman, and so we have always had a Gilman safety project in our TIP. And so this incorporates those ideas as well. So when we first kicked off our efforts with our consultant team, we gave them these objectives. We wanted to make sure that our work with Gilman addressed the safety concerns we've had. Also plans for the future of Gilman, not just looking at what are today's needs, but looking forward with the Central Issaquah plan and the future development along that area that's anticipated. What will Gilman need to do and function to support that? We also really wanted to have meaningful community participation, knowing that this was a unique opportunity to really reimagine an existing road from the ground up. That's not something that we do every day. And along with that, make sure that we build some consensus and feed into potentially future city projects. So in March 2017, council approved this project. With that, there was a lot of discussion that this project should take a different approach. We should not go out to the public with our preferred alternative. We should not go out to the public with two alternatives and let's pick one. We should go out to the public without a concept and listen to what the public wanted and get their feedback on what the vision for Gilman should be. And so that's what we've done. It's a different process than what we've taken before with other projects. And we really did go in and first ask the public, what do you want Gilman to be, right? And so with that, we have this framework document that you guys have tonight. And that really is this higher level visioning document. It discusses all the community engagement that we've done over the last year, and also really shows what we've discovered as far as goals, objectives, challenges. And it's not a concept, doesn't have those cross sections, but it's an interim step to work towards that concept. Taking this with your guys' endorsement forward, saying, you know, we're heading in the right direction, and this is what we're going to use then to develop the corridor concepts. So I wanted to overview a little bit with the community engagement. We had a variety of outreach methods and targeted a variety of audiences. So we did online and in-person surveys, had stakeholder meetings where we specifically targeted the business owners and property owners along the corridor, as well as targeting the residents, and also attended various boards and commissions. So first, we did these stakeholder workshops where we invited the property owners and business owners along the corridor. And really, we heard a need for some bike and pedestrian improvements. We also heard a high value placed on traffic in those conversations and how to make sure that we address the vehicle and the car as well with our projects. And then also a key thing that came out of that was making sure that it was implementable. We had an online survey where we had a great response rate and had a really diverse geographic area represented, and a lot of really good quality feedback that came out of the survey. And then we also had a meeting with the public, targeting residents, and things that, when we had a mix of residents, community business leaders, and council members attendance, and the two kind of fun concepts that came out of that were the park once and be able to walk to your variety of destinations idea that we talked about a lot, and also a signature street concept and talking about knowing that Gilman is special. It's the heart of our commercial core. How can we make Gilman look and feel different than any other street in the city? You know, Gilman's different than East Lake Sammamish Parkway, for instance. And so how do we go about doing that to make Gilman truly the heart of our commercial core? So this illustrates the variety of touches that we had. We were out in the chamber newsletter, various boards and commission presentations. In the mayor's report, it was presented at the chamber luncheon, and got up one early morning at the Tibbetts Park and Ride and handed out flyers for people to, as a captive audience, fill out the survey in the morning, and also hundreds of business visits. So our economic development team, as well as some project ambassadors, really helped us out in contacting all the businesses.
So as we were doing the community engagement, a key part was to also do the existing condition analysis. Like Brianne said, we looked at all the key past as well as concurrent projects that were going on. The past projects such as Central Issaquah Plan, or the concurrent project just as the 2018 Park Strategic Plan, which, for example, gave us very clear direction that the community had envisioned the Gilman corridor to be part of the larger green necklace. So it was very critical for us to take into account what the existing plans had already told us and how do we incorporate that in the work that we are doing. We did start off the project by also doing a big brainstorming session with all the key departments across the board, be it parks or police, public works, traffic, because we wanted to learn what the staff had learned about Gilman and what they knew about Gilman, not just in terms of key data like Brianne talked about with regards to accidents happening along Gilman, but also what the community has been telling the staff, because that was equally important to us. Out of which came up different challenges, constraints, assets, as well as opportunities that we began to map and look at what the corridor looks at, what are the wide network of trails that crisscross this corridor, the different natural elements, including the creek that goes across the corridor. We wanted to make sure that we were responding to the assets that exist along the corridor, the constraints that need to be addressed, as well as the opportunities that we would like to maximize as we begin to listen to the community and understand what they want this to be. And as we began to do our initial analysis, existing condition analysis, we did find that the corridor changes its character, be it in the number of lanes, the width of the right-of-way, the kind of improvements that exist, the pedestrian or the bike facilities that exist or do not exist along the corridor, the planting that we have. It changes its character, and we wanted to respect that changing character. And as Nathan is going to talk about, that is what the community also said, and they wanted to make sure that we designed to the changing context. And then last but not the least, we also looked at the overall regional context, the wonderful natural resources we have around the area, but also looking into account in the future as we get new sound transit opportunities come close to our corridor, how could it maximize that opportunity? But it all began, like Kurt as well as Brianna have said, is on a meaningful community engagement, which brought us the vision and goals, and Nathan is going to talk more about that.
Okay, so as Brianne mentioned, we really had great participation across the board, from the online survey to people attending the workshops and the stakeholder meetings. And I think the city really deserves the credit for kind of identifying the need for this project to be approached differently than the standard public works or transportation project. So I think that's kind of a pat on everyone's back at the city's side. And it wasn't just the residents. You know, I think it's important to understand that we were talking to also the employers and employees that come to and work along Gilman. And so recognizing that those folks might come more frequently, they might be coming multiple times a week, they might be getting to work slightly differently, coming on buses, leaving on buses. So they have a very different perspective of Gilman than people that are coming to shop, use the retail, to use different services along the corridor. This is one of the maps from the online survey, and it really shows that there are no unimportant areas along Gilman. The shops and the businesses are really important to the city of Issaquah and Central Issaquah. There's a variety of kind of reasons people come: shopping, eating, services. You can see that people come fairly frequently. It's not, you know, every couple months, but, you know, every couple weeks, every couple months was most of the feedback that we got from people. One of the things that was really great about the online survey platform that we were able to develop and ask the questions to the community is it allowed them an opportunity to give specific place-based feedback for comments that they had on the corridor. So specific issues that they see day in and day out as they're coming to visit, they were able to drop a pin on the map and give us specific information saying, this driveway always has a problem. This intersection traffic never moves. And we were able to get really good kind of insightful, real feedback from the public and from property owners and business owners during this. Here are some of the specific comments that we got, at the west end, really looking at the kind of length between SR 900 and 12th Street for that first block and the lack of opportunity for people walking across the street. The dangerous crossing I think that's just to the west of McDonald's driveway, for people trying to get in and out of the driveway. And at the other end of the corridor, one of the ones that was highly commented on was the kind of Gilman, Rainier, Juniper intersection. I know there's development that's happening on the north side that's going to address traffic associated with that development and making sure people have access to and from that new development, but it doesn't address the kind of multimodal need associated with the trail crossing or the existing mid-block crossing that's to the west of that. So that was, we got really good information that really gave us as designers a lot more insight into the opportunity.
Councilmember Winterstein?
Pardon the interruption, Nathan.
Yeah.
Something you just said caught my attention.
Yeah.
And maybe if you're going to address this later on, that's fine. It's kind of a technical detail. I think we do have a plan for that mid-block crossing that's now west to move that east to where the Sammamish Trail is. We're going to move that. That's going to be part of the development. We have a partnership with the landowner there.
Right, so the development agreement with Gilman Lofts,
thank you. That's it.
Eliminates the mid-block crossing, that signal, and puts in a signal at the intersection. What it really doesn't address is the Rainier Juniper end of the intersection.
Right,
So,
and if that's what you were referring to, then that's, I agree. Thank you.
So it's kind of the proximity of those two intersections right there and the kind of problems that happen for all users. The stakeholder meetings were an opportunity for us to hear directly from property owners and business owners along the corridor. We were reminded about the importance of the corridor for all users, and I think what was very insightful for us to remember is that it's not just people walking and biking in an urban context. There are businesses, Hearth and Home, that really rely on people driving their car to come and buy things and take something kind of, you're not going to come buy a fireplace on your bike. And so it was really good to get specific feedback from folks like that. The Tutabella property owner who was really interested in kind of visibility to businesses and how potential future street improvements could change or impact their ability to attract customers. Driving, traffic, that was kind of one of the biggest things that we heard throughout the online survey and from property and business owners. We also heard people that they were very appreciative of the process that the city was going through with this project. I know we had heard that there were past projects where the communication wasn't as, didn't happen as early, and kind of after kind of EIS studies have been done, kind of people would find out after the fact that things were changing to their driveway access. So they really appreciated being part of this process and wanting to continue that through the duration of it. And then also really talking about the importance of the implementation of this. The community workshop, Brianne mentioned, we really talked about kind of the shift from a suburban to a more urban dynamic that's going to be happening in the future as sound transit comes. Yes, that's a long ways away, but it's also important to make sure that the city gets out in front of and kind of helps to plan around that rather than respond to it. And so here are a series of slides that I just want to flip through fairly quickly, but they summarize the online survey results. And these are some of the initial goals that came out of that staff workshop in the early spring of the year. And I think it was at the March workshop. And you really start to see that the goals, the final goals, really varied significantly from this through that outreach process that we went through. Supporting business and economic development, strong support for all of the questions that were asked here. Driving improvements and kind of the importance of traffic was the #1 thing that we heard from folks throughout the process. We were able to get kind of the map-based information, so we were able to see that From a signal standpoint, there are a lot of issues at the east and west ends of the corridor, but as you're talking about accessing specific businesses, it was something that was really happening throughout the whole corridor. Walking improvements.
Actually, can I ask a signalization question?
You may.
So my understanding is that one of our challenges is that we don't control the lights either around exit 15 or because that's federal and Highway 900, which is a state corridor.
Yeah.
Can we design our sequencing to just key off their sequencing? Like basically, they could be the drumbeat, and we could just, you know, make our system a slave to that system from a math standpoint.
So I'm not a traffic engineer, so I'm going to turn it over to Kurt to.
So the short answer is yes, and we do. To the degree that we can, and we do coordinate with WashDOT. They're, as you mentioned, they are optimizing their corridors, and that includes the freeway and the ramps, and so they're trying to make those work as best as they can. But we have all those timings, we work with them. Interestingly enough, as part of this corridor work and looking at the existing conditions, we had a traffic engineer on the team look at the signal timings for Gilman, and they're, I won't say they're optimized 100%, but they're pretty darn close to operating about as well as they can. So still probably need to look at that again, but we are coordinated to the maximum degree that we can be with WashDOT, and our corridor progresses. Some might argue with when you're waiting there at a signal, but it progresses at the optimum way that it can. So
thank you.
So walking improvements, safety, visibility, providing separation from traffic, those are all things that rose to the top. The amenities associated with the walking environment, again, were really related, kind of focused on kind of improving safety, visibility, street trees, providing separation from the road. Street trees was actually the second most written in comment that we got through the online surveys, which is pretty interesting, and it kind of shows the respect and the care for that existing tree canopy that exists today. Biking improvements, really focused on improving the regional trail connections and the desire to provide a facility off-street, away from cars. People recognize the importance to kind of support and improve the transit stations. And then one of the things that we saw reviewing all of the existing planning and policy documents is the importance of the natural environment and kind of Issaquah Creek and opportunity to manage stormwater. And that's something that was really looked on highly from the feedback that we got from the community.
Question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I know you're going really rapidly. Go back 2 slides, please. Right here. Can you tell me how many existing bus stops we actually have on Gilman?
I want to say it's 3 or 4 in each direction.
And do you know how many? My impression, so this is not data driven, is there are not a lot of public transit trips down that roadway.
Yeah, there's only a couple of routes, metro routes that.
And they don't have the kind of the regular, fairly frequent service that maybe you would expect in a more urban setting. So I find this very interesting. It says, prove what's there, but don't add new. That's the way I read that. I mean, maybe that's a little bit too strong, but I would think of this issue in particular that we have to, whatever we do here, there's a wider mobility master plan that we're going to work on, and the presence of and planning for public transit along this roadway is very important. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think as the project moves forward and kind of sound transit discussion happens, it's really important to coordinate those. So these are the final community vision goals. So, we started out kind of asking about 5 or 6 goals from our workshop with the city, and fairly different set of goals that was identified. So kind of the overall framework plan is what the final document that was developed. This is kind of summarizes our existing conditions analysis and research, the community outreach, the project process. It's really a summary of the community's vision and goals, and kind of discusses how those goals need to be balanced as the project moves into concept development, and kind of recognizes that right now these are all equal weighted goals, and depending where you are on the corridor, there's going to be different levels of importance. It also begins to strategize how that vision is implemented. So this is the kind of graphic representation of the framework. It's the representation of the 9 sets of opportunities that are documented, and it's really kind of a consolidation of the ideas in the community's vision, and ultimately it's kind of a mind map to some extent of the gathered and learned information from the year kind of working with the community. What it isn't, like Brianne said, a concept plan. We don't know where curbs are going to be located. It doesn't document the type of intersection improvements at different locations. It doesn't define the type or the location of a proposed bike facility, or address how trees that will be impacted, how that kind of succession will happen. The typical content that's documented with each of these 9 sets of opportunities are kind of the applicable mapped elements for each opportunity. We go through the different users, kind of drivers, pedestrians, bicyclists, transit users, different elements related to the environment, and streetscape opportunities. We identify key objectives, kind of high-level strategy goals for each set of opportunities, and then document design challenges and considerations that are really kind of our roadmap to moving those sets of opportunities forward. And to the extent that we can document all of this information from this first year of work moving forward, so that we're not having to go back and kind of rethink the wheel. And then kind of how each set of opportunities aligns with project goals. At the end of the document, there's a section on next steps that really consolidates the important kind of tasks and elements from within the document to move this forward from phase 1 into phase 2. There were several key things that kind of came out through the community process that I don't think were on the city's or the design team's mind, kind of really thinking about the kind of future of the tree canopy and kind of the idea of developing a tree succession plan. During our workshops with city staff, operations and maintenance folks, really understanding how does existing infrastructure that's below the street, how is that going to interact with and impact kind of partial redevelopment or private redevelopment parcel by parcel over time as this happens. And so that was, those were 2 things that were identified that really need some more thought moving forward. And it also helps to communicate kind of next steps with partner agencies and the public.
All right. So I took the framework plan out to the various boards and commissions to hear what they had to say. So the Economic Vitality Commission also discussed the opportunities to try and improve traffic flow, similar to what we heard in those business meetings. They also, though, recognized the importance of pedestrian walkability and acknowledged that we will likely have to consolidate driveways to achieve some of those safety improvements that we're looking towards, and acknowledged that that's necessary, and just asked that we continue to have a good public process and work closely with affected business owners and property owners. Our Parks Department, we really got into that tree canopy. It is a well-loved tree canopy. It is also a little bit challenging for our Parks Department because they're all about the same age. They're starting to face similar issues. And then we also have the edible landscape throughout the corridor. And so we really got into the need for a tree succession plan so that we're not in a position where we lose all of our trees all at once due to age or issues. And so how can we continue to step that in and preserve and maintain a tree canopy throughout the corridor was a big topic of conversation. We also, with the Parks Board, discussed relocating the edible landscape. Currently, that's along Gilman in various locations. Our property owners and business owners have a lot of frustrations with it because it is hard to maintain, and there's often fallen fruit and food on the floor, which can attract unsightly things. And Parks has, again, because it's this linear function, it is more challenging to maintain and for everyone to come out and pick. So a big topic of conversation at the Parks Board was also relocating the edible landscape to a place where it could be more of an orchard type growth. And the Parks Board was very excited to continue that conversation as to where that could go. That's not something that we have put in place. Yes, Councilmember Winterstein?
Thank you. So on your slide on final community vision goals, you do have natural element as one of the 9 goals. You've just talked about the edible landscape.
Mm-hmm.
You also used an interesting phrase about tree succession, which I love the planning. I like that. What are those part of this natural environment as a goal, and what are maybe other elements of this natural environment goal?
The natural environment really celebrates the, you could call it a ditch or you could call it a creek along Gilman.
Salmon-bearing stream, I believe.
And how can we incorporate and improve and beautify and utilize that, as well as trying to utilize other green infrastructure, rain garden type opportunities. So that's really the key of the natural goal.
Okay, so the
goal.
trees and the edible environment that you're talking about fall into what category?
Also that.
Oh, okay.
All of the above, sorry.
Okay, all of the above.
Yep.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So Parks.
Sorry, we have a Councilmember Hunt.
I have a follow-up question, which is about how, because I see a disconnect between the goals and the goal for the natural environment and the removal of the edible landscape. So I don't see how, if you're making that as part of the objective for enhancing the natural environment, I'm not sure, I don't connect with the rationale for removing the edible landscape on that goal. Is that what you're saying?
That we would remove the edible landscape?
No,
Yes.
that meets the goal of enhancing the natural environment.
We are saying that there are challenges with the existing landscape that's out there today, and we recognize that it's important with the existing tree canopy, and people do use and appreciate the edible landscape, and that with those issues, maybe there's a better way that we can look at it going forward. So, relocating edible landscape to another location that might be more user-friendly. We don't have people picking the fruit on the side of the road, the maintenance issues that we have with the linear function of that, as well as recognizing that when our trees do reach the end of life, we don't want to have them all have to be removed at the same time, because we will lose that canopy. So how can we phase that in and really consider it from a holistic planning view so that we don't lose those things that are important?
Follow up. All right.
Okay. Parks Board also really keyed in on the Three Trails Crossing intersection, and that's something that they discussed a lot in their green necklace and continue to really support some improvements there. And they also want to look at the entire street network with respect to non-motorized users and really consider where the function and where the function lies for Mall Street, the Maple Juniper Trail, as well as Gilman, and how do we look at it holistically and not just at Gilman. PPC really supported the landscaping that incorporates stormwater, also really getting into that destination or signature street, and also acknowledging that traffic was a concern, and really supporting the off-street bike space. And then Development Commission also supported green infrastructure and wanted to celebrate that existing creek and use that to add to a pedestrian experience throughout Gilman. And they also really wanted to make sure that we still continue to consider the role of a future sound transit in some proximity to this area, and how does that impact or how does that impact the design of this corridor? So we've talked a lot about where we have been with this framework development, and really looking at that in the next phase, we would really look to develop that concept, corridor concept. That's really the tool that we need as developers come in to be able to say, here, this is what we would like you to build. It also is that tool that we look towards to say, maybe there's some pieces in here that we don't think a developer is going to do, or key intersection improvements that we think is important for the city to take on. And so we look to that to identify what, potentially city projects might come out of that, as well as, like I said, what developer improvements we'd expect as the developers come in.
Just a few more slides here, and then we're going to, we're looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. So as we've talked about, way back when, a year ago, we had some really simple goals for this project, pretty straightforward. We were going to go out and listen to the community, and from that work, we were going to move into a phase 2 of this project, where we would use the information that we gathered from the community in phase 2 now to do two things. We know that the corridor will redevelop. We've already seen some projects along the corridor, and it's likely that that there'll be more, probably sooner than later. We know more things are happening. Issaquah Sound Transit's on its way, and other things. So there's likely to be more development along Gilman, and to have this corridor work and to have the corridor figured out is super important to us in helping us condition development correctly, so that we get the right buildings built in the right places along Gilman. And then in addition, there may be capital projects that come out of this work. We haven't defined those yet, and those will need, of course, some funding discussions depending on what the projects are. So that's a whole nother conversation, but it may be, it's unlikely, I would say, that there's going to be a single capital project that builds Gilman, so to speak, but there may be smaller capital projects that come out of this work that may make sense. So those were the original goals. I think as we've done the work here, and these folks have mentioned some of these already, just I'll go through them again briefly. So we looked at infrastructure at a high level. In this first phase of the project, we mapped the project, we know where all the property lines are, we know where all the utilities and the infrastructure are, but we haven't done a real in-depth assessment. And so where that, just to give an example of that, where that comes in useful or handy is as the corridor redevelops, what size should that water service be? What size should that water line be? Do we have sufficient sewer capacity? Those kinds of things. Do those utilities, for example, need to be upgraded? So a more detailed infrastructure assessment will save us money in the long run, and potentially, if we have that figured out, it's easier to condition development as it comes in to build those pieces of infrastructure that we need. Tree succession plan, we've talked about that, and just there's old trees there. Everyone values the trees. Everyone values the edible landscape. There's some very special things about this corridor, and we want to make sure that going forward, we have a plan that's going to continue that success. So as we mentioned, just not to belabor the edible landscape discussion, but I think we all recognize the value of that, and it's certainly a treasure for Issaquah. It may not, Gilman per se may not be the very best location for that. There may be a better location where we could have a even more successful edible landscape than directly on Gilman. So just wanted to point that out. Design guidelines, if we're going to be approving development as it comes in, being as specific as we can and telling them what we want them to build, so that we only build the corridor once, is super important. With more clear design guidelines, we're again more likely to get exactly what we want and build Gilman just once. So when a piece of the corridor redevelops, developers will build those portions of Gilman. And then the implementation considerations. So what that's about is development will build portions of it. There'll be portions that look just like they do today. So how does that work? How does that fit together? That's not a trivial question to figure out how you fit together portions of the corridor that are redeveloped and portions of the corridor that look like they do today. And then I think finally, and not lastly by any means, is continue meaningful outreach. We think we've done a great job in our outreach so far, so we want to continue to maintain that, keep the community involved, maintain the trust that we've developed in the first phase of this. So finally, they will be coming to you as I don't have this quite developed yet, but we'll be coming to you with a scope, a schedule. We believe this is approximately a one-year effort. I know that council's going to have some funding discussions as early as this week, so that may help us understand a little bit better where this project fits in with all our competing interests. And in this scope, in the second scope, as we've talked about, we'll continue to finalize and dial in our infrastructure. We'll further develop emerging concepts, and this is where you'll start to see cross sections and what this corridor could look like, and that's the final concept. And again, against a background of robust public outreach. So I think with that, we're done, and the whole team is here, and we've got about a half an hour, I think, or a little bit less, 20 minutes. And we're very happy to answer any questions or listen to any comments that you may have.
Councilmember Winterstein?
Thank you, Tola. Oh, put that slide back. You just lost the slide.
We can go back or forward on any of this.
I know that's fine. The task, recently, we've been through the process of developing a corridor concept for Newport Way West. You're using the same label here. I'm assuming that this part of this task is similar to what transpired and what we experienced in the Newport Way corridor concept
I'm going to
development.
let the Newport Way corridor concept.
Looking at Brand, though, I realize
talk to you about
she's a no longer.
But she is.
But Kurt, you're going to own it now, but I don't know that Brienne is. I'm assuming.
But if you want to talk about Newport.
I just want to know.
Yes.
I have an idea what concept is. It's based upon what we did at Newport. Are you talking about the same thing?
Yeah, coming up with that cross-section and looking at, an overarching view of what does that look like laid upon like an aerial. So not getting into the level of this is the exact type of curb we're using or anything like that, but that higher level corridor concept, yes.
Yeah, and you laid out options, and that's where we had options, and there were many opportunities for people to respond to and offer their inputs.
Yeah.
So if it unfolds like that, then I understand that, and I think it's a good plan. That was my first question. My second question is, again, I'm looking at final community vision goals. One of these 9, one of them says vary design by street segment. Now, Brienne, you surprised me actually when you said, or when it was said earlier in the evening, I think the gentleman who spoke first maybe mentioned this, how you actually looked at the street today as it is and said there's kind of some natural segments, which I thought is a little bit contradictory to the overall plan going in that we're more visioning on what this needs to be and should be and can be. Obviously, we're working at constraints. And now I see kind of a goal that seems to me that was maybe shaped by what's already there, and now it may be even codified in having a goal like this that says very designed by street segment. So did I did I understand that when you showed the diagram, you saw 5 segments and you're breaking it down to like what's there now? It feels like we're maybe carrying a little bit of the as-is forward, but that seems in contradiction to one of our goals.
Yeah, so the existing context, not as much as the infrastructure that exists today, but the land use, the right-of-way widths, the natural environments, the stream that parallels Gilman, the creek that crosses it, And then the built environment, knowing we've got I-90 along a section, property ownership. So kind of really looking at things that aren't going to change or are unlikely to change when you think about land use. Those are the types of things, not where curbs are, or where trees are, or where utilities are. Does that help?
That does, and is that the same as saying, as this goal says, vary design by street segment?
Yes.
Are you
So
talking
thinking
about the same
context
segment?
of those segments, from whether block by block or multiple blocks, but recognizing that what happens from SR 900 to 12th has a very different set of needs and issues than what happens around 7th or happens at Front Street. So we don't want to just take one typical section and extrude it through the whole 1.4 mile corridor, because there are different things that are more important in different locations. And that's why we've got 9 goals, but they're going to have to, you can't fit all of those things into your limited right of way. Is that?
I like the image of which you just extrude it. It's just a machine, extrude it. So the last is a comment as much as anything, and I hope we can avoid 3-week shutdowns when we finally do this.
+1. Councilmember Ray.
Just a couple of clarifications. Can you go back to slide 24?
Can you tell me what it says on the top?
Yeah, it says community survey, place-based feedback.
Oh, that's your slide, Nathan. It's the map.
Close, really
map.
close.
About
That one.
there.
Oh, that one. So I see red dots and brown dots and aqua dots and purple dots. What do they mean?
So there were 5 main questions within the survey, or kind of segments. One was about issues or opportunities for people driving, for people walking. Was number 2 for people biking, for people taking transit, and then a set of questions related to the natural environment. So each of those colors corresponds to those kind of section of questions from the online survey.
Would it be asking too much to get a legend?
No.
I mean, it would just be nice to see
Yep.
what a purple dot,
Yeah.
because we got some of those that are kind of outside the corridor. So it would just be more meaningful to me. And then on page 29, which is support for initial project goals. So plan street improvements for light rail. So I have not heard anything, and this could just be me, but from Sound Transit that says that Gilman is where light rail is going to go. So is that what we hear from Sound Transit, that Gilman is going to be the part of the light rail vision?
No. So we don't know where the light rail station will be landed precisely. We have a feeling it could be in the vicinity of Gilman. And not necessarily meaning on Gilman, but somewhere that Gilman could be a main access point to that station from one way or another. And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't do anything that precluded that.
City Administrator.
Thank you. Just a quick add-on to that. What Sound Transit has told us is that we're the end of the line. It's likely to run in proximity with I-90, and so our conversations have been a little broader than Gilman. What do we need to think about within some swath south and north of I-90? And so Gilman gets taken up in that.
Yeah, and I just think about it, if they stay to their current plan, we're still 22 years away, so that's a fairly lengthy planning horizon. So I was just surprised that it was the #1 support for initial project goals was something that's 22 years away.
Yeah, I'll just add that it shows up in various city documents in terms of our kind of legislative ambitions, our regional planning ambitions, and it's showing up in your draft strategic plan. So I think we have spoken about, as Brianne and the consultants mentioned, trying to get ahead of the curve and start some community conversations so that we can have the readiness when Sound Transit turns to us in earnest to begin that work. We've also heard from them that they anticipate turning their attention to us sometime in, let's say, 2023 to 2025 range. So if you think about that, getting started in the vicinity of, say, 2020 with some community conversations doesn't seem that far off.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Hunt.
One question, then a couple of comments. So the first question is, I know that, and from talking to the community, one of the challenges has to do with making a U-turn or turning around or getting to a business that's on the other side of the street with some of the intersections that are more tricky to navigate. And so could you go through what are some of the options that are on the table for making those
Right, so we haven't gotten into that level of detail. We did hear that from the community that U-turns would be helpful along the corridor, and as we take a look at that corridor holistically and determine where places will have full access, where places might have limited access, where U-turns might be necessary, that'll be something that would really come in through that corridor concept development. It's not something that we have at this level.
So as Mr. Winterstein pointed out, for the Newport, the Western Newport project that we've been working on, that starts to be more to give it a number, the 30% design level. So we'll start to look more at those details in phase 2, start to look at how intersections should be configured, where you might need to make U-turns, those kinds of things. That's all the work that we're planning to do in this next phase. So this is different than how we've approached many projects, and it really was intentional to go to the public and have all these meetings and hear what all the concerns are and what we should focus on as we go into phase 2. Maybe another way to approach this whole project would have been to come with some cross sections initially and just come out of the gate with those, and we really, again, intentionally did not do that because we wanted to have everything out on the table and hear from the community about what was important and then go to work on phase 2.
And then I have a comment on the community process. So I attended one of the community meetings, and I heard a lot from people in that meeting that the survey was very fun and engaging and gave a lot of opportunity for, putting your pin on different places, and it was very interactive and very fun for a survey. So compliments on that, and I think it got a lot of good information, which is informing where we're going. So that was great, and there definitely seemed to be a lot of support for that kind of way of providing feedback from people. And then I have a concern, which is about the tree succession plan and the edible landscape. So to me, looking at the main goals, it doesn't seem that any of the goals as far as safety or visibility for businesses or the main objectives for the corridor plan are addressed by removing an edible landscape. It does seem like it's an opportunity to maybe do something that would be a asset to the community in a different location. But my concern is that there's not information about what the plan is for moving it, and I would like to see more information about that. And I do appreciate the letter of support from the Parks Board, and I appreciate that there's going to be more information about that. But I wanted to raise it as a concern because I know that the food bank, Issaquah Food Bank, currently gleans or harvests food from the edible landscape, and I know too that some members of the community enjoy that, and I'm concerned about having it go away without having a plan for replacing it, because anytime we're removing something that is a public benefit to some people, I would like to know more about what the plan is for replacing it. So that's my concern. And I was looking about the Beacon Food Forest in Seattle. I know there are other options for how to have these kinds of orchard type settings. And so I'm interested to learn more about what the plan is, but I'm concerned because I don't see very much specifics about the plan right now.
Council Deputy President Batiste.
So thank you for the presentation. A lot of hard work and so much community engagement that's gone into this, and that's great to see. I assume that when we get to phase 2, we'll be getting more information about timelines and prioritization within these goals. I was really glad to see the tree succession plan and share some of the concerns that Councilmember Hunt has brought up, but just having that be a part of the overarching goal was great to see. And with the outreach, and I don't know if you've gotten down to this detail, but the continuing meaningful outreach, will that end up boiling down to getting outreach specifically on each goal? So when the group is working on tree succession planning, that there's outreach specifically for that and being able to hear back from the community.
So we're in the process of, as I mentioned, developing that scope and outreach plan. So that's good input. We'll certainly look at that as we're developing that scope.
City Administrator Moon.
Sure. I just want to clarify and hopefully reassure that, as the team has stated, we understand that the edible landscape is a well-loved attribute of the community, and we want to have that persist. We're just not certain that it's sustainable in the location that it is currently in. There's no plan right now to go in and take it out without already having a conversation with community about what might be a better location for it. So we're not, just as we have not settled on a concept plan or type of curb that would be placed in the future, we haven't had any of those subsequent conversations about where might the garden move to. So I'm seeing it less as, removal with no replacement, but just that we've brought this issue forward, that there are some concerns about it in its current location, and we need to have some community dialogue about what to do about that.
Councilmember Goodman.
So the question that you have for us tonight is how we feel about this framework and whether we endorse it moving forward. I'm struck by the incredible thoroughness of the work that you have done, and this is in very, very top few presentations I've seen, body of material that I've seen since I've been on council that has been this thorough, and so I want to commend you on that. It's very impressive that the amount of work that you did to go out to the community and get the information that you did, and I echo the Emily will roll her eyes, but I echo the concerns about the edible landscaping, and I think one of the reasons is because we just went through this exercise on Front Street where we didn't have a plan in place, and the community didn't appreciate that. So, so I'm excited about the next phase and to see what concept we come up with. Thank you.
Oh, no? Councilmember Winterstein.
I'll just add my voice to that. I would like to see you to proceed as requested. But of course, I know that there's a financial ask in there, and we have to address that question still. So obviously, and I don't know that it's going to be talked about this within a week or so, but as was mentioned earlier, but agree with Stacy's comments about the thoroughness and the completeness that was there. I always love it when consultants show up at the city and say, we've not seen it done this way before. And what you're complimenting us on is the amount of engagement and the forethought and the inclusiveness of the wider community before we do projects like this. So thank you for that. And thank you, Kurt and Brianne, for your team's work.
City Administrator, do you want to just clarify the statement about that when we might have conversation about the funding for the next round?
Sure. I think we will touch on it in a generic way as we have the ad hoc finance committee meeting both this week and probably not too much further into the calendar. We'll meet again, and then I'm anticipating we're going to come back to council. We had said before the end of the first quarter to kind of talk about all things capital that are unfunded. You also know that we have upcoming conversations about the multi-year CIP. So I'll need to huddle with our staff and see what the recommendation is on that front, see if we have new opportunities I'm not aware of right now for additional funding sources. And so I'd hope we'd be back to you to tell you what our recommendation is on additional funding request to advance the next phase of work.
What's the order of magnitude of round 2?
The order of magnitude is for phase 2, I think, is around $400,000 is what we're looking at now.
What was phase 1?
Phase 1 was something less than 2.
135.
Yeah.
All right.
And we're in that 400 to 500,000.
Councilmember Ray, you look like, no? Oh, okay. Councilmember Hunt.
I'm going to add 2 final thoughts about the edible landscape. So the first one is that it's very clearly called out on our treasures list for the city as number 18, fruit trees, parks, bridges along Gilman Boulevard. So all of those things are important to the community. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is I wanted to echo Stacy's comments about the street trees and the big impact that it has. And I think people don't actually, people might not appreciate that a lot of the feel and a lot of the character of a given street has to do with the trees until the trees change. But a lot of that street's character right now does have to do with the fruit trees and the diversity of trees that are along the street and the diversity of shapes. And I previously worked at a botanical garden, and I remember like driving down that street and thinking like, wow, all these different kinds of trees are on the street. It's actually quite unique, and it really does lend to the character. So I am really concerned about the tree succession plan. It's great that there's a plan to have a plan, but I want to know more about it, and I want to know more about the plan for relocating the food forest edible landscape orchard concept.
And since we're all talking about it, I'll add a thought. At some point, we have to figure out what to do with the other half of Squaw Valley Park. Now, I realize that an edible orchard thing is probably something you want to have in the walking part of the city, but I'll just throw that out there that at some point, the grove that we have down there with the trees that were planted, that's something we have to figure out. And it'd be nice to find some use for it that could over time become something important for residents. Anything else on this one before we move on? Anything else from the administration, from your team? All right, well, thank you very much. Got quite an enthusiastic response from council, so good job. And with that, we will move on. I apologize because I don't have it ready to go right in front of me. However, oh, there it is. ID 0369, of course, Old Town and Transit Center's parking study. How could I forget?
Good evening, Council President, Deputy Council President, council members, and City Administrator. I'm Matthew Mornick, Special Projects Manager with the Mayor's Office. The city's Economic Development Manager, Christopher Wright, and I have co-managed the research and analysis of the latest parking study. Chris Braylon and Daniel Dye from Fair and Pierce are our consultants. Daniel is here this evening, along with his colleague Kendra Braylon, to answer questions. Daniel has provided thoughtful input and guidance through this effort. Our aim tonight is to go through the work completed over the last 4 months that illustrates what is going on with parking in the city. The story is extensive, and it should take about 35 minutes, and we will work through these 4 sections. We'll start with first the background, then outline the study's methodology and findings that point to the options before council. If it pleases the council, I request that you take note of any questions that come up along with the slide numbers as we work through the presentation, and once we're through, we will answer your questions and seek your input on next steps moving forward. Parking concerns have existed in Issaquah for years, particularly in Old Town, where we have a mix of businesses, residents, and attractions that at times strain the on-street parking resources. In July 2016, council directed staff to develop a proposal to create additional parking capacity in Old Town within a 2-year period. During a December 2017 budget work session, council went one step further and approved funding for a parking enforcement pilot program. Staff initiated this study in August 2018 to inform a potential pilot initiative, and because there was a general perception that parking capacity in Old Town is inadequate, that parking and ride garages are full, and transit riders are parking in areas intended for short-term parkers. Parking resources are strained, and whenever we have major community events, and that people park wherever and whenever without repercussion. This study follows previous parking assessments. The downtown parking utilization studies in '98 and 2012 concluded Old Town generally has ample parking, with specific blocks being highly utilized. The Central Issaquah parking analysis evaluated multifamily minimum parking requirements in Central Issaquah and found multifamily projects are providing adequate off-street parking. People simply park on-street because it is more convenient. For the current study, staff completed a more in-depth data collection and analysis of parking both in Old Town and near the Issaquah Transit Center and the Highlands Park and Ride garages. Our focus has been to complete a thorough data analysis of on-street parking and determine whether a parking shortage exists or other systemic parking issues are at play. Once equipped with a clear understanding of what is going on, we develop parking management options for your consideration tonight. Parking management varies greatly between jurisdictions based on parking supply, demand levels, tolerance for pricing, and local values that guide parking management. From top to bottom, this graphic illustrates low-level parking management to more cost-intensive strategies that include paid parking, time limits, permits, and loading zones. Best practices in suburban cities typically entail low-level management, which with time transitions to more intensive parking management strategies. With increased management comes increased costs, primarily around enforcement. And please forgive me, I'm not sure why the presentation keeps jumping ahead. So do you have any idea what's going on? No. Okay, we're just going to run with it. Issaquah's current management strategy is request-based enforcement. And what this means is that the city places low priority on parking enforcement using existing patrol officers, given the already extensive workload on the police department. Federal Way, Des Moines, Linwood are other cities nearby who employ a similar strategy. It is important to note nearly all cities in the Puget Sound region adopt this strategy in lower density areas of their communities. While there is no industry-defined standard to trigger more intensive parking management, there are thresholds jurisdictions aim for before implementing a higher level of management. A common target is to encourage parking turnover in mixed-use areas where on-street occupancy exceeds 85% for several hours. So 85% means that 1 to 2 spaces per block are typically available at any given time. More than 85%, the perception is that there's nowhere to park. Lower than that does not typically warrant parking management. The focus here is to ensure that short-term parking needs, such as patrons or people seeking government services, are prioritized over long-term parking. Puget Sound communities manage parking resources differently depending on local factors. Cities with extensive parking restrictions, such as street sweeping, residential permit zones, extensive time limits, and parking meters, have conditions where parking enforcement becomes a revenue generator. Cities that are examples of this are Seattle, Tacoma, and Everett. Cities like Bellevue, Redmond, and Kirkland, with moderate-sized enforcement programs, strive to break even. For cities with small enforcement programs, such as Federal Way, Des Moines, and Linwood, the system costs more to enforce than the revenue they bring in. Even though costs for parking management often outpace the revenue it generates, cities like Bellevue, Redmond, Bothell, Renton, and Kent use a mix of time-limited parking and full-time enforcement for mainly these reasons. When on-street supply is constrained, users get the perception that an area is full, and they either circle or they decide to leave. A car parked on street all day typically turns over 1 to 2 times. When enforced, cars parked in time stalls turn over 5 to 8 times. So higher turnover yields more economic activity. Patrons, visitors, employees, residents, and commuters, they all benefit when a structure simplifies the decision-making and expectations. So when parking lacks order, frustrations increase, creating a negative perception of driving to an area. Finally, a clear understanding of who has priority to parking stalls allows cities to develop policies that get the right user in the right space. A robust data collection effort was our primary focus in August and September. Data was collected across 3 study areas on 4 days. Dates selected include low activity levels and those with higher community calendar activity. We wanted to ensure that we had dates before school began and while it was in session. We looked at the inventory of existing public parking supply on street and in unrestricted lots. We looked at parking duration, average and peak occupancy, average vehicle turnover, average parking durations, and violation rates. Staff and the consultant team selected 50 blocks within the project areas noted above. And those blocks are marked in black. I just want to take a moment and explain how we use this data. By focusing on the 50 blocks, we're able to extrapolate data for similar nearby blocks. For instance, activity and occupancy level on one measured block face typically mirrors activity found on blocks within 200 feet. Because we use this technique of feathering data between collected block faces, the consultant team generated an overall map that shows parking hotspots in areas of lower utilization. 4 days of comprehensive data collection yielded telling results. Although the Issaquah Transit Center garage reaches capacity, little or no transit parking spillover was observed in the study area. In part because on-street parking is limited near the transit center. And we found that whenever there was people were unable to park within the garage, there was a significant amount of parkers in the Tibbetts Valley West lot, which on average reaches about 60% occupancy at peak periods. Parking on Mall Street is moderate, but appears to be utilized by people parking for nearby businesses. And during field observations, we noted inoperable vehicles were parked on Mall Street for more than 24 hours. Highlands Park and Ride is highly utilized, no pun intended, and typically reaches about 90% occupancy by 9 a.m. Field and survey observations indicate that most of the long-term on-street parking nearby is related to adjacent residential and business uses, not transit parkers. Most vehicles parked on street in the Highlands parked for less than 2 hours. Outside of the highly utilized park and ride garage, there is abundant parking available in the Highlands, both in off-street lots and on-street. In Old Town, approximately 60% of all parking is occupied during peak hours each day. This map illustrates the highest occupancy levels during data collection. This level of parking occupancy is similar to what was observed in the 2012 parking study. A common pattern during the busiest part of the day has several blocks exceeding 90% occupancy in the Old Town core, while during this time, outlying areas with on-street parking were less than 60% occupied. This figure illustrates on-street parking by time of day and day of week in Old Town, and these maps were compiled by our consultant team to illustrate, in general, what was happening hour by hour on any given day. So, for example, looking at Sunday, August 19th, by scrolling through the map, this is between 8 to 9 a.m., 9 to 10 a.m. You can see the changes over time within the Old Town. And this is Sunday the 19th. It had lower levels of activity, but you can still see peak activity happening later on in the day. Do you have a question about the maps?
You asked us to hold our questions?
Yeah, but I see Councilmember Hunt. Yeah? Okay. For perspective, we compared these findings with downtown cores in other cities. Redmond and Everett experience occupancy rates slightly higher than Issaquah. Bend, Oregon averages peak occupancy periods on weekdays that reach roughly 73%. Everett employs an extensive parking management program, while Redmond takes a moderate approach with parking management, employing diamond parking to enforce time limits. Data collectors observed a low number of violations within the study area, as reflected on this slide. This is a relatively low level of violations. And for context, from 2015 to 2018, the police department averaged 109 infractions per year in Old Town through request-based enforcement. Citywide, the police department averaged 340 parking infractions during the same period. Not only did we collect quantifiable parking data, we also surveyed over 100 parking users to better understand parking behavior. Surveys were tailored to each stakeholder and were collected online and in person by city staff. Staff surveyed 288 transit riders in the Highlands and 132 at the Transit Center between 7 to 10 a.m. Findings demonstrated that 6 people parked on street instead of within a transit agency-owned facility before catching a bus. Most riders at the Sunset Way bus stop walked or wheelchaired to the stop. If commuters could not find a space in one of the park and ride garages, the primary backup plan was to drive to another park and ride that fills up later. These findings are similar to what King County observed with surveys conducted earlier this summer across the entire park and ride network. In other words, most transit patrons do not park on street to catch a bus. For the senior center, most patrons drive and park near the center. About 42% reported having to park more than a block away from the center. Several survey comments noted the need for more lighting along Creek Way, more ADA accessible parking, and more parking for the center in general. In surveying city staff, we learned nearly 90% of staff drive alone to work, which is common for a suburban-based employer. The majority of staff park immediately in front of their destination. And in the survey, there was notes of difficulty finding parking midday and the need for secured and well-lit parking for police personnel. Finally, of the 76 commuters surveyed at the Sunset Way bus stop adjacent to City Hall, 7 people reported driving and parking nearby. The vast majority of people walk, bike, and are dropped off to reach this bus stop. Now, we turn our attention to the options based on these findings. Parking management near the Issaquah Transit Center and Highlands Park and Ride is less of a necessity due to the lack of on-street parking and the fact that transit patrons do not tend to park on-street. In the transit center area, council may consider staff to provide education about the Tibbetts Valley East and West lots, educate businesses and enforce existing code requirements that prevent long-term storages of vehicles on Mall Street. And third, staff could monitor Sound Transit parking permit program and reassess if parking spillover changes. For the Highlands, council could consider signing or painting curbs in front of more frequently blocked fire hydrants. This is not a major problem, but it would immediately redirect the roughly 7 vehicles observed who regularly parked in front of hydrants. Long-term, staff could continue to monitor on-street utilization every other year. If parking is routinely over the 85% threshold for several hours a day, time limits may become at that time appropriate. Staff could clarify city standards regarding employee parking with businesses and track King County's parking permit initiative. Staff and our consultant team developed 2 options to provide more parking management in Old Town. So the first option is really focused on education, outreach, and signage. It does not include enforcement. This is a relatively low-cost option where parking information will be provided via signs, website information, and social media campaigns. It recognizes that parking is busy in some locations, but generally available within a 3 to 5 minute walk of any location in Old Town. About 285 parking stalls were available area-wide, even at the busiest of times during the data collection effort. There are benefits to waiting and coordinating with the forthcoming wayfinding plan, ongoing facility needs assessment, and the city's strategic plan. Though it does not include parking restrictions, staff believe option 1 yields more efficient use of the existing on-street parking resources with future opportunities to collect, reassess, and then take action. Option 2 is a pilot project to install and enforce 3-hour parking time limits from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. on the busiest blocks in Old Town outlined here in the map. This option recognizes that Old Town has adequate parking supplies with limited parking availability in the core. The 3-hour time limit is based on data collection findings to limit the number of affected parkers. 80% of parkers in Old Town were observed to park for less than 3 hours, so that's how we came up with the 3-hour time limit. However, time limits would cause parkers to be pushed outside of the core area in favor of creating convenient short-term parking availability. If time limits are enforced in the downtown core, employees will likely be displaced from the black blocks to the red blocks. Red block faces have over 170 spaces free, even if all of the blocks were at their occupancy every hour. So these outlying blocks most likely will handle this potential shift of parking. For option 2, enforcement is going to be a critical component to its success, as parking users disregard time limits without a disincentive. Additionally, time limits would require numerous signs going up in Old Town, which could affect the aesthetic character of the area. We estimate for private enforcement initial costs of roughly $200,000 with $167,000 per year in ongoing expenses. Alternatively, if we did in-house enforcement program, we estimate initial expenses of $368,000 with $139,000 ongoing per year. Once we outlined the options resulting from the data collection effort, we turned our efforts to gauge community support in an online open house. So we wanted to get community sentiment regarding these potential options. A total of 227 responses were received, and overall, respondents supported option 1, not supporting option 2. And the lack of option 2 really was most pronounced when the community was asked whether spending city resources on parking management and enforcement in Old Town is a high priority. Overall sentiment was no. In between options 1 and 2 are other actions council may want to consider individually or in combination. So for option 3, based on the findings, the city is positioned to wait and evaluate. There is no capacity issue in Old Town or around the park and rides. There are no pressure points that were identified in the study areas that incite the need for immediate parking management. Council could delay action and in 2 years deploy the same data collection methodology and reevaluate in 2021. Alternatively, staff could work to encourage more efficient use of privately owned, built-out parking assets in areas adjacent to highly utilized parking in Old Town. This would maintain private parking during business hours, but activate parking assets after business hours, thereby adding capacity. For option 5, council may consider creating higher parking space turnover in areas close to City Hall, the municipal court, the senior center, and the playground. 3-hour time limits addressed most visits to these areas. This would limit the scope of enforcement, but it would shift employee parking. A downside, staff would have to create and manage a daily permitting program for visitors parking for more than 3 hours, which dilutes the effectiveness of creating time limits to begin with. We wanted to outline additional considerations, things that we've tried to keep our eye on while evaluating these 5 options. I'll walk through them as briefly as I can. Staff will need to update Chapter 1028 parking regulations of the municipal code based on council's direction resulting from this study. There are 2 core legal documents that we use when we go out and we cite infractions for parking. We use state law and we use the municipal code. The vast majority of citations that are issued are a result of state code. So we only have 1 to 2 laws within our municipal code that we actually cite violations for. So should council decide to move forward with any of these options, we would go and look at our municipal code and potentially update those sections and specifically update the violation rate. Parking violations in Issaquah are $26. Raising them to $40 to $50 aligns with other neighboring jurisdictions, and it provides a greater incentive to follow the parking regulations. Currently, the court fees consume all the current violation revenues. Several survey and open house responses noted the lack of ADA accessible parking availability near the senior center. Very generally, 1 accessible stall is required for every 25 public parking spaces. The parking lot between the senior center and City Hall meets the minimum requirements, but this doesn't take into account the nature of the primary uses of these facilities. For D, several survey respondents noted low-level lighting levels between available parking and destinations in Old Town. Wayfinding for parking is scheduled as part of a larger citywide wayfinding effort in 2019. As this project gains momentum, staff could include information on the city, chamber, and Downtown Issaquah Association websites outlining on-street parking availability. This is also a low-cost way of making it easier for people to visit the area. Currently, the city is working with a consultant to assess municipal workspace. Actions resulting from this effort may involve municipal parking and should be considered as parking management strategies in Old Town are evaluated. This effort may have acknowledged it is best practice to provide secured parking for the public safety fleet and for vehicles privately owned by our police officers. And G, conducting parking counts every 2 to 3 years will track if, when, and where more extensive parking management strategies are necessary. And using the same methodology that we used in this parking study effort is a relatively low-cost undertaking and will build on the data that we've collected in 2018. Additionally, there's options for paid parking, which is a management strategy that we typically engage after time limits have been enforced. It would likely be revenue neutral due to the acquisition, operations, and maintenance costs of these systems. However, if the extent of Issaquah's managed parking areas grows to other densifying areas like the Highlands or Central Issaquah, long-term, this could become a revenue generator. And finally, the Downtown Issaquah Association could elect to initiate a parking and business improvement area. A business improvement district, if approved, could expand funding for increasing public parking supply, parking enforcement, or streetscape improvements. This funding mechanism requires 60% of affected businesses and multifamily properties to approve the district. It is largely self-governed by a ratepayer board, so the city could not propose what to spend revenue on. It is up to the ratepayers. If time limits are implemented, employees will likely be pushed into the surrounding residential areas. The city could put the framework in place for neighborhood-initiated residential parking zones. RPZs can be managed in a variety of ways, but in general, it ensures parking availability for residents via a residential permit. With this comes significant costs to the city to manage that program. And it's just important to note that new development in Old Town is required to provide dedicated off-street parking per the city's land use code. Staff expect new development will generally increase the overall supply, reducing pressure on the existing on-street supply. Strategies we are not recommending. It's worth making a final note that an employee parking permit program will dilute whatever parking management strategy council directs staff to employ. Therefore, we are not recommending it. While some survey and open house respondents encourage publicly owned structured parking as a standalone use, this would require a large investment of taxpayer dollars and would likely never be repaid even with parking charges. And I'm happy to answer any questions on that. So my colleague Christopher handed out a document, a one-pager summary. Thank you for your attention through an extensive amount of information. What we tried to do with this one-page document is to just outline questions to help you navigate the options before you, along with the questions here on the slides. My colleagues and I seek your direction and are ready to answer your questions.
Who wants to kick off? All right, I will. Oh, nope, Councilmember Hunt.
Okay, so I wondered about the municipal code change option. It's not specific to these, but when you're talking about the municipal code and then talking about how very few of, most of the enforcement is for the state code. So could you provide more information about what the code change would, what the expected impact of that code change to our municipal code would be?
Sure. So Chapter 1028 outlines the parking regulations for the city. 102820 outlines fines paid for parking for over 24 hours. And so we would potentially reevaluate that and determine whether or not, right now it states within our code that after if someone violates this law, we can directly impound their car, which seems like an aggressive stance to take. So we would potentially build in some additional room or guidance for police officers or code enforcement officers around that regulation, as well as Section 102890, which outlines the violation penalty. It's very general. It says that a penalty will not be issued for more than $250. So we could, per your direction, revise that section and outline the specific kinds of violations that we have seen historically, outline it directly within our municipal code, and the associated violation rate, rather than relying on the violation rates set forth by the state, which are on average $26.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question about the senior center. You mentioned that it does meet the requirements in terms of having ADA compliant parking stalls, but then also that there was in the survey and in talking to folks, I think there's interest in having more parking that's more accessible for people for patrons of the senior center. So are there options that, I guess, what are the studies what are the recommendations coming out of this study in terms of those options, or what are the city's options that they're considering?
Thank you for the question. We have not developed any recommendations regarding lighting along various walking corridors between parking resources and destinations. But with the coming master planning effort for Memorial Park as outlined by the park strategic plan, that would yield a really good opportunity for staff to go ahead and look at the photometric assets along Creekway and on I believe it was Rainier, to potentially improve those assets.
Council Deputy President Batiste.
Thank you for the presentation. A lot of good information that we're going through. So the additional options 3 through 5 that are down at the bottom of the chart. So those are different options that could be even added on to option 1 or 2. So for example, when we're talking about in option 1, wayfinding and that kind of thing, the public-private partnership option could be added onto option 1 as an additional avenue to try to help with parking in that way. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Just trying to make sure I'm understanding. And then with the 3-hour parking limit, what was the end time on that again? There were times associated with that. What time does it end in the
10 a.m. to 8 p.m.
8 p.m.
Yep. So based on our observations, and any of my colleagues, please feel free to chime in, we observed that parking peaked midday and between 5 and 7 p.m. But in general, if we have a 3-hour time limit, people parking at 5:01 p.m. would have no issue through the duration of the evening. People parking beforehand would have a problem and would have to move their car to not exceed the 3-hour time limit. And enforcement would have to account for that.
And was there a discussion around other time limits, like a 4-hour time limit, or some cities have 2, some are longer, but 3 hours tended to be what you were seeing? In
mining the data, we were able to observe that based on vehicle turnover in Old Town, that most vehicles, in fact, 80% of vehicles would stay for less than 3 hours. So that's how we landed on the 3-hour number, to essentially not disrupt the majority of people coming to Old Town.
Thank you.
So first a general question. Are there ADA implications? You talked about, the average walk is a 3-minute walk. You then talked about number of stalls for folks who, disability stalls. But is there some ADA guidance in terms of, as you get a higher fraction of your stalls being used, if only 10% of your stalls are ADA compliant and 85% of your stalls are loaded up, then you get to a point where someone who's looking for an ADA stall is going to have a long haul to the between where they're parking and their destination. So does ADA give guidance in this?
So the slide in front of you outlines the federal requirements for ADA stalls, which gets back to the 1 per 25 spaces. And my colleague can, I think, speak a little bit more to your question.
Yeah, so on-street parking is treated a little bit differently by ADA. It's not per se that you have to have a certain number of stalls unless you have specific marked spaces on street. So if you were to go out and mark each individual space, you would have to have this number of stalls per block or block face. But when they're not marked, when it's just one big box like Issaquah's parking is, there's no specific requirements. I do think it's important to provide ADA stalls where you can, but there's no specific ratio like there would be if there were individual stalls. And there was past work by Public Works for the city that looked at whether it would make sense to change from marking a big block or marking a big box for parking versus marking individual stalls. And you actually get more capacity by just marking that big box because people can kind of move around, shorter cars can park closer, so.
All right, thank you. That seems a little counterintuitive, right? If I was somebody who needed an ADA stall and, you know, parking was 85% full, and so the nearest, I guess we don't have ADA, we don't badge anything ADA downtown? ADA compliant?
There are ADA stalls right behind City Hall in that parking lot, and some of the more off-street feeling stuff along the train depot. But on street, there is no ADA stalls. It's something that cities are starting to consider more. Seattle has just had to implement things. They kind of got a letter from the FHWA that said, hey, you should be providing on-street stalls since you have a paid parking program. So that's something that as you manage more, they do require more ADA provisions.
Okay, thank you. So those are the first of my 4 questions. The next is, can you go to slide 25?
Sure.
Question here. Okay, so I was a little confused about raise awareness about Tibbetts Valley lots. Okay, so that's the lot you're showing there plus what's the other lot? You said lots plural, so that's one
Okay,
lot. What's
so
the other?
the east and west lots. So there's a second parking lot on the east side of Tibbetts Valley Park.
Oh, where people park who use the park.
Yes.
I see.
That under an agreement with Sound Transit, dating back to '97, that it is designated for transit parking spillover from the garage.
Okay,
And it is not utilized by transit parkers.
got it. Okay, slide 32, please. So you made a statement that respondents preferred option 1, not option 2. Do you have any numbers for that?
Yes. So, we organized the online open house on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree. When option 1 was presented as whether or not it was a good short-term strategy, respondents replied 3.56 on average. That means that they generally agree with this statement.
And then option 2?
That one, Was it?
So there were a couple of different questions we asked on that one. For option 2, we asked, will it make it easier to park in Old Town? That was 2.98. The one that really made it clear that it wasn't a high priority for people was when we asked about spending city resources on it, on enforcement, and that was a 2.5. So you're kind of, with all of these kind of Likert questions, you're kind of tending toward the middle, but that break line of 3 is exactly neutral, so.
Yeah, on the one that was 3.6 versus 2.9, what was the standard deviation on that?
I do not know, but I could pull it for you.
Because that's not, I mean, you're approaching the point where, you know, I think you said they strongly preferred option 1, and it's not really, I mean, you're getting to the point where the data doesn't seem to support that statement. But it depends on what the standard deviation is on it, right? If it's super noisy data, then.
Yeah. So it was pretty clear, just looking at the spending city resources, it was very clearly.
No, that one I get, and that had a larger difference between the option 1 and the option 2. You can answer it later. If you'll get back to me with that, I would appreciate it. And then the last one is slide 38. So these things where there's like an order of magnitude difference in a quoted metric drive me nuts, right? Because that can't, it can't be, right? I mean, that can't be that, you know, Issaquah's is 100 and Sammamish's is 20, right? There's some actual cost per parking stall. And this number, every year, this number goes up. What I'd like to request is that, and I realize the fundamental point of your presentation is that we don't have a parking problem, and so we don't need structured parking. But nonetheless, these sorts of things I get super skeptical about. So what I'd like to ask is some sort of analysis of recent parking structures in King County, particularly in East King County, to understand what the actual costs have been for recent developments. And I understand Kent has one that's an outlier, right? That's a huge number. But, you know, we can't, you know, using N of 1 is just management by anecdote.
So this is not going to answer your question of getting to actual numbers, but I can give a little bit of insight on why those vary so widely. So something like the library garage, where it's literally 2 levels, it's almost at ground level, you know, it's just digging down a little bit, going up a little bit. That's going to be, excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold. That's going to be on the $20,000 range versus if you're looking at 5 stories, if you're looking at elaborate architectural screening, which may be required by your design standards. If you're looking at digging down, those are the things that get up into that $100,000 thing. So you're right, it is a larger structure that is going to cost $100,000 per stall, like a Sound Transit park and ride garage, but it really just depends on what you want to build. One of the other things that we did think about when we thought about whether to suggest a structured parking lot is that you're going to have a problem with siting. So if you site it on one end or the other of Old Town, then that's not really going to be convenient for everyone. The library garage, as far as we're aware, is kind of public parking right now, and I was just looking through my data. There are very few hours when it goes above 60% occupancy. So if you put another parking garage, it's probably going to be similar. It's not going to be very highly utilized, and that's a fairly small parking garage at 89 stalls. So just gives you a little bit more context on the structured parking.
Right. Thank you.
I forgot to talk about land. Your property costs are going to be the other big thing that drives up or down that cost.
Got it. Thank you. Questions? Councilmember Winterstein.
I was going to ask a question about standard deviation, but Tola already asked it. Thank you, Tola.
Took the wind out of your sails.
I should know the page number. I'm going to teach you a trick. If you just type a number and then hit enter, it jumps right to that slide. So if you want to go to slide 2, hit 2 and enter. If you want to go to slide 38, hit 38 and enter. It's a really nice thing.
That's nice. Yeah, thank
When you number these things, and I can say go to slide 15, you can go 1, 5, enter. Okay, that's late. And I don't know this number because the version I'm looking at doesn't have page numbers, so I apologize. The question about enforcement, you mentioned in your comment, it's on this enforcement slide, and it's about 80% into the presentation. You talk about the total number of enforcement citations citywide and then in Old Town. Again, I want to ask about standard deviations, but I'm not. What is the significance of reporting it that way? What's the message there? You just threw some numbers out, but I'm curious about this 342 citywide and then 109 in Old Town. Are you saying that, is there any message there or not? Are we saying that's relatively high? Is Old Town is higher than kind of the rest of the city, or it's lower, or it's just like the rest of the city?
Sure, I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I'll tell you the catalyst for this was at least to make sure it was understood that we do write citations for these types of violations. And then I think what would be helpful is to just kind of put that in the context of overall number of citations that the police department writes in a given year so that you can understand how frequent that happens. I think it was also a good metric for us to have in order to understand the cost equation for implementing a program and what sort of cost recovery we might have on such a program. But if your question is more about do we see more violations in one area versus another, and does the data reflect that, or is there something else going on? Then that would be a question we'd have to ask our police department.
I'm not asking you to see something in the data that's not there. You answered my question. You said,
great.
We do citations, and here's what it is in this area, and this is what it is citywide. But these are all reported, right? Since we don't do the enforcement, someone's got to call in.
That's correct, in part. Our police department, of course, can do what we call self-initiated activity, and if they see a violation, they will write a ticket. But by nature of these violations, a lot of them are complaint-driven violations. Those calls come into the police department, and as we have the resources available, we go out and investigate and take action.
Okay. And last question on slide 32. Oh, you're so close. All you have to. The residents, employees, and then customers/visitors. So many stakeholders involved in this particular area, especially along Front Street, are business owners, property owners. Are they in this? Were they part of this as well? I mean, you don't have a category for them, and your numbers only add up to 200, and there's 227 people participate. I'm just, because there is some other information, this idea of that stall right out in front of my door that's easy for someone to come and go really quickly. I can see how special uses would be perceived as beneficial to a small business owner because that are dependent upon, say, on-street parking. But I don't know if that voice is included in this open house data.
Okay, so this is essentially a self-identifying question that led to these categories. After we had all of our data and findings, we went out and we formulated these options. We revisited meetings that we had with stakeholder groups, and Christopher Wright met with the Downtown Issaquah Association a week prior to us launching the 3-week-long online open house. And so we provided them all the information we provided you and encouraged them to participate in the online open house. Anything you'd like to add to that?
All right.
Yeah, we do know that there were some business owners that did answer the survey, but in addition to that, in meeting with the Downtown Issaquah Association and the merchants downtown, we really wanted to hear what they had to say, because this is obviously highly impactful to them. And so what we did find when we went back and kind of presented the initial findings of the data that we presented, it was compelling to them. It comes down to then whether, your definition of a problem, right? And that comes down to how far are people willing to walk. And so the downtown businesses, upon talking about the data and the findings, when you present them with the fact that there is a decent amount of parking within a 3 to 5 minute walk, You know, the data backs it up, and then it just even logically when people stop and think about it and think about, okay, yeah, I guess there is. You know, within a quarter mile, there is plenty of parking. But again, whether that is acceptable or reasonable to ask your customers to walk that far, that's where you start to get different opinions. And that's why, you know, in our survey, and I can't remember if Matt mentioned this or not, but 70% of the respondents said that it was reasonable to walk 3 to 5 minutes to the site that you're visiting. They either agreed or strongly agreed with that. And like I said, that's compelling. And so then what we need to do is to kind of reconcile people that think it's a problem, that it's not a problem. We just want to make sure that that parking that is within a 3 to 5 minute walk is easy to find, and that walk, that 3 to 5 minute walk, is as pleasurable and as safe as it can possibly be.
All right, thank you for that. And I did find compelling that argument, this idea, if I'm going to go park, whether it be a block or 3 blocks away, or after many turns and I've maybe lost my way a little bit, I got to find my way back to my ultimate destination, to knowing that that's going to be a safe walk, that there's going to be a good walkable surface, that there's going to be lighting. Sunsets, you know, it's approaching 4:45 or sun, you know, today, you know, our days are getting longer, but we all know that. So that has an overlap, I think, especially when you talk about in the Old Town area, somewhere where that spillover could be, you know, those things, that isn't true everywhere, and we kind of know that. So I think that's if we were to do more, and I'm in favor of this, you know, somehow making those more remote locations easy to find and to get to and fro from, then it requires this additional work for the safe routes to do that. So I'm in favor of that. And I'm really looking forward to your answer to Tola's questions about, you know, the data. Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Council Deputy President Batiste.
So I just wanted to ask a couple more questions about option 1 in terms of the wayfinding and branding initiative scheduled for 2019. So can you remind me, we don't have costs associated with the wayfinding and branding here, and then we also talk about evaluating lighting, and that could mean adding additional lighting. So we don't have any costs associated with option 1. So could you speak to both of those issues? I know we've been talking about wayfinding and branding for quite some time, and so I'm curious about the timing of when we could go forward and the costs associated with that.
Okay. This fall, a city team came together, interdepartmental team came together to initiate work on a city wayfinding and branding effort. Funds were secured through the budget process of $250,000 to kick off the study work of that project. So analyze a citywide wayfinding program and revisit the city's branding language and design as part of that effort, because the two essentially go hand in hand. It was planned as part of that effort that in the first quarter of 2019, this group would go out with a request for proposal, with the design being to do the work and initiate the study in 2019. So does that provide some context?
However, wouldn't this be really an added element to, I mean, we've been talking about wayfinding and branding within the city in general, and so we've talked about that during budgeting, but this is really a whole added element. I'm assuming that it would come with additional cost.
Well, I'll just add briefly and let Administrator Moon speak, but when we think about wayfinding, it's multimodal. It's not just strictly wayfinding for trails or wayfinding for pedestrians or bikes or buses or visitors. It's the whole gambit. And so We already anticipated when we requested funding that a core component of the wayfinding effort, wayfinding and branding effort, would include parking.
What Matt said. It's going to be part of this.
I guess my question, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I'm just wondering if it's to the level of what would be impactful in terms of choosing option one, and this is our vision going forward, and it just seemed like it was taking it up another step, ratcheting that up, and seemed to, to me, potentially involve more costs, but
yeah, I think we have ample budget to get the work done. It's more than just the study. It's actually coming up with, as Matt described, the language, the look and the feel. It's also coming up with a plan in terms of where in our geography we want this kind of wayfinding to exist, whether it's virtual or physical or both, and then actually some funds set aside to start doing any physical implementation that we need to of the plan. So it's not just study work, it's actual, it includes some money for implementation. Our thought originally was that we would start on the park side because the park strategic plan also called out the need for wayfinding and branding. But I think our team believes that we would also be able to allocate some budget toward the parking system as well.
Okay.
And I just wanted to add, as part of option one, what we have now with this study and all of the data that we collected, what we have now is information and a kind of a new lens that we can use to look at many different city projects, not just the wayfinding plan, but the streetscapes plan, the city's facility plan. As Matt mentioned, when we look at improvements or come up with a master plan for Memorial Park, now we know some additional information to incorporate into those. This next year we'll be looking at Title 18 in the IMC, which is the land use code, and there's a parking chapter in there with particular regulations about parking in Old Town. Like I said, this data that we have is going to be used in a lot of different places, and not just in wayfinding, but incorporated into other city projects as well.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ray.
Thank you. Really interesting. And then I was spending a little bit of time as you were talking, looking through the customer input or the citizen input data, and most of the data that Council President's looking for is in that document. If you dig a little bit, just because I found it just fascinating. Because, but I guess what I'm really struck with is when I look at all of the things that you put on the table, and I guess what I'm reading between the lines that there's a recommendation in here somewhere. But to me, we kind of said, okay, the Issaquah Park and Ride is okay because we have overflow. We're saying the Highlands Park and Ride is not sufficiently bad that it's impacting surface streets. So we're kind of zooming in and we're focusing now on Old Town. And then the question becomes, okay, there is capacity in Old Town, it just might not be exactly where you want it. So then we're going into a discussion about, okay, so what is a reasonable circumference of from park to where I park to where I want to be? And then I think there's another question there about how do we create an environment that it feels safe to be able to move that 3 to 5 minute commute from where I park to where I want to do business. And so if I kind of unravel everything that I've heard from y'all tonight, I guess what it comes down to is the recommendation is parking today isn't on fire, and people are not, when we interview them, not saying that it's on fire. There's places to park. People are okay with a certain amount of a walk from where I park in Old Town to where I do business in Old Town. And I guess the only thing that I'm hearing along with the wayfinding, and I think Councilmember Winterstein hit on this, is how do we create it so it feels safe, so people feel comfortable, because the circumference of that commute is fairly large and pushes off some of the more well-beaten trails. That being said, I think that we are continue to be a fast-growing city, both in terms of residents and people who do business here and in businesses, and this could change very, very quickly. So I think there's a need to continue this. This should be an ongoing thing that we look at. But I think in the short term, what we need to do is figure out how do we create a safe environment within Front Street and the Old Town areas so people feel comfortable in walking from where they park to where they need to do business. And I think we need to do that regardless of parking.
All right. So we are roughly, between this and another council meeting, we're about 4 hours in at this point. It's my perception that our energy level may not be as high as it was several hours ago. So you're looking for a sense of the room in response to this issue. So Chris just gave a nice 1 of 6, and I'm wondering if maybe what we want to do is just sort of give our thoughts to what we've heard here tonight, and then see if that's sort of sufficient feedback. I mean, we could go through question by question and whatnot, but I sort of feel like if everybody gave their thoughts the way Chris did, we'd probably have a pretty good sense of the room. I'm not seeing anyone violently opposed. Council Deputy President Batiste.
So I would be interested in going forward with option 1. I still do have a little bit of an outstanding question about the when we talk about safety. So to tag on a little bit to what Councilmember Ray talked about, as we're looking at that, the lighting that might be needed to provide that safety. And I would also really like to see, just in terms of Old Town and evening parking, I'd really like to see the public-private partnership piece moved up to option 1. So we could look at that in addition to wayfinding and branding. I continue to think that is a good option, something I've talked about several times in the past.
All right. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you. I do think that probably option 1 is where we ought to focus our efforts right now. I don't think we're quite ready for the time limits. I think given that the responses that I read were, sure, time limits would be great, but not sure, but we don't want to focus our financial resources on that. And given that we are working on our strategic plan right now, maybe that's something that we might keep in mind either this time around or next time around, that we're updating the strategic plan after we adopt one.
Thank you. Councilmembers Winterstein or Hunt? Councilmember Hunt?
I agree about option 1 seeming like the way forward, especially my interpretation of the comments is that 3 to 5 minutes is acceptable for most people, and the capacity is there. So very high on the list of needs would be just to make sure that people know about where parking is and the lighting issue. I did like that it's being considered to paint the curbs by hydrants. I think that would be a good way to make sure that people follow that. And I think I don't think that it's called out in the options, but it was in the presentation. And I know that people park in front of them, but I think a lot of it is just not awareness and people are used to looking at the curbs for where they can't park. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And then I am generally in favor of option 1, but I do wonder about addressing the senior center a little bit differently, or making sure that those needs are addressed to make sure that people are able to get to the senior center, especially since that's undergoing that it's going to be run by the city, and just making sure that the parking is adequate for that specific use. So in that way, I'd like to see option 1 maybe with some special considerations around how to make sure that that particular area addresses the needs of patrons of the senior center. That's it.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Thank you. Yeah, regarding the park and rides, I think the management strategy that you're recommending is just to continue to monitor. And so I appreciate having the data. That is, I will tell you that I'm not sure I'm surprised, but based upon comments I've heard over the last couple of years, I think those results will be surprising or to many people. The large reason we did this study was people speaking about the perception that we've got serious issues. So this data tells its own story, tells a different story. So that's I want to make sure that we get this properly communicated, and I don't know what that looks like, but there is a significant number of people within the city who have that perception, and you know, we responded. We did something about it. We collected data, and this is important. And I think generally people want to know the facts. They want to be informed. They don't want to go just on anecdotal data. We have this available, and let's make sure that that's accessible. I don't know what that looks like, but I do know that there's perceptions out there that's different than what the data says. And as far as the Old Town, I think I would, yes, you can infer what I said earlier. I'm in favor of what is being recommended here. I'm going to challenge you, however. I think this is my own perception is to talk about maybe a 3-minute walk is one thing to park to then to your destination. I think to talk about a 5-minute walk is actually something significantly more. And especially if you know the street grid around this area, it's not obvious. It's not like, well, just go 2 more blocks that way and then 2 more blocks the other way. It isn't. And so it's one thing to have distance. It's another to know the distance and the length of the walk. I think 3 and 5 are actually quite different numbers. I know if, you know, I think that would make a difference for me. If I can't get something really close, 5 minutes seems like a long time, and I might come back at a different time. But I think that just highlights the fact. And your maps there that showed the blocks that you studied and all of that, you just look at that grid, you know what's going on there. It's not a real easy place to just go explore and find what needs to be found. So I think the actual threshold for customers, for patrons that want to go places, if it's a quick visit, if it's something where they're going to spend a little bit more time, I think that's a little bit easier, but we do have a lot of businesses that are dependent upon walk-up business, and they're not necessarily a food establishment where they're going to spend some time. So my sense is the sensitivity does change. I'm going to continue to talk to people about that, but I think gearing it more toward the 3-minute threshold and everything that we can do to, I think the comment was made about public-private. I think that's, you have this example picture in here for a Wells Fargo bank. I don't think that's in Issaquah.
No.
Yeah, it's too bad we couldn't have one. Do any of those exist in Issaquah? Be great if there could have been an example here in town. If such partnerships exist, my gosh, let's take pictures of those and put them up so we know, or mark them somehow, or pursue them. So that comment that was made earlier by one of my colleagues about public-private partnerships, that's, we've all seen that, especially if you go to the theater around that time. Look at all these empty lots. Can I park there? Can I not? Not really sure. The sign says no, but boy, it's empty and there's nobody working there. And if we have business owners that are actually amenable to that, then we should absolutely enlist them in this program. Thanks.
Great. There are just to respond to that, there are a handful of lots that we've kind of looked at that are near high utilization parking on street in Old Town. And an example would be to target outreach with the Edward Jones lot, as they have a decent number of spaces, roughly 20 spaces, which are almost completely unused on weekends and evenings.
So I'm going to go with the body that obviously option 1 is the direction we want to go in. A couple of thoughts. I have a nagging fear that there's a bigger picture that we might be missing, which is that I think that there may well be sort of an equilibration point that you get where, yeah, you've got, at peak around 85% use because, at some point, as you get closer to 100% use, people stop coming to downtown because they know traffic is so bad, right, and so hard to find parking. I personally don't go to Seattle most evenings because it's such a pain in the butt to find parking, and I don't go into downtown Issaquah all that much in the evenings. I prefer to go to North Bend or Snoqualmie where it's easier to find parking, and so I think there's people like that, and so I do, we're gonna do this option 1, but I just have this nagging fear in the back of my mind that if somehow people felt like it was easy to find parking in downtown, we might have more people downtown and our businesses might benefit, but I don't know how to get our arms around that as an idea. The second thing is I think we should definitely monitor some of these standards, the 3-minute standard, come up with an idea of what fraction of people we want to be able to be no more than 3 minutes from where they're going, and revisit this on a regular basis. Maybe regular basis is once a year, maybe it's once every 2 years. I don't know. But take this data and say we're going to put a flag in the ground, and we're going to say that as long as it stays below this number, we think things are probably okay. And the third thing is I want to just do a +1 on the questions around lighting, and I think it's particularly an issue because we get so much rain. You have this weird thing where it's like it's dark and it's super rainy, and your situational awareness just sort of shrinks to right around you, and you just feel like I'm not as aware of what's going on further away from me because I can't see it very well and because it's raining. So we have this sort of particular thing, particularly in winter when it's darker anyhow. So the idea of investigating how we can do lower cost but effective and non-obtrusive lighting would be a good conversation to have. Councilmember Winterstein?
Just a couple follow-up quick comments. First of all, actually, the parking situation in the Old Town area actually almost never prevents me from going there when I want to, any day of the week at various different times. So my point is simply that what's here and what's available and how well it meets my needs is worth it, even if the parking isn't convenient for me when I have to drive. Secondly, I'm looking forward to, at least for the Squawk Mountain, when the public transit becomes available, because this is something my wife and I have discussed before, and we talk about it with our neighbors and friends as well, that, boy, there'll be a time you'll be able to pull up your smartphone or make a phone call and say, I need a ride here, and then you can get that ride home. And it'll be interesting to see if those numbers will be significant enough to help make more parking stalls available to people who don't have that convenient and low-cost option available to them, which is coming to Squawk Mountain. You know what I'm talking about, Matt?
No.
Okay, well, it's going to be in partnership with Metro, and we got a presentation a few months ago, and both the Talus neighborhoods and Squawk Mountain neighborhoods are going to get some new public transit service, and it might be on demand, and it will be the kind of rates we're used to for public transit, as opposed to private taxis or Uber or Lyft or something like that, public transit type costs for trips that begin or end on Squawk Mountain or Talus. And it'll be a real good option, especially for nighttime entertainment, evening times for those residents.
Thanks for sharing.
Paul. Other comments? City Administrator Moon, do you have what you need from us?
Yes, I think we do. Thank you very much.
All right.
Just real quick, Council President, just have a standard deviation we'd like to share with you.
Yeah. So which question would you like the standard deviation for?
One where the answer for option 1 was 3.6 and the answer for option 2 was 2.9.
So the one that was 3.6, the standard deviation on that was 1.13, and the other one that was 2.98 is 1.13.
All right.
And I couldn't make that up if I tried because it's all done by technology.
It's nice. I think a statistician would tell you then the help me. What's the term I'm looking for? The relevance is not high on this, right? Yeah. The significance, thank you, that's what it is.
Apologies if we did overstate that. It is, resident or respondent slightly favored option 1, while slightly favored, slightly disfavoring.
That's all I was asking
2.
for. All right.
One quick follow-up for the council member's statement about transit. that is actually something we are seeing in our industry with TNCs already, is that is reducing the need for parking. That's happening first at airports and hotels where their parking revenues are going in the tank. But that is happening more in downtown areas like Seattle and Bellevue, and it will just continue more likely with Issaquah as less people own cars, less people own multiple cars, parking needs may go down in the future, so.
Thank you for that mathematical clarification. Appreciate it. Any other closing questions, comments? Anybody on council? All right. Administrator Moon, going, gone. We are adjourned. Thank you.